Dobar večer i dobrodošli. Evo, odmah su me bojkotirali. Ja sam Denis Pilepić, dopredsjednik udruge Spirit. Neću puno dužiti, zahvalit ću svima samo što ste došli. I htio bih za početak samo da probate s ovim, da li to sve radi. Znači, molim gospođu tamo da prevede mene na hrvatski, tako da ljudi čuju. Ono što morate je upust slušalice i pritisnuti jedno dugmence koje imate tamo na tome. Jer se čujemo? Čujete gospođu prevoditeljicu? Aha, vi mene prevodite na engleski. Isto okej. Dok čekamo, ja ću još predstaviti, sebe sam predstavio još jednom, Denis Pilepić, dopredsjednik udruge. Jedan čovjek koji je zaslužan, što je Rik danas ovdje, Saša Hrast, moj kolega. I naravno moji ostali iz udruge Spirit, kolege. Hvala. Evo, s obzirom da mislim da više nema ruku, ja ću prestati dužit i pozvat glavnog gosta i jedinog gosta, koji će vam u prvih nekih sati nešto objasniti o svom iskustvu i o svemu što trebate znati, a nakon toga ćete moći postavljati pitanja. Zato će ići ovaj mikrofon kasnije, isto ćete dizati ruku. Još neko? Nema? Ako nema, gospodin Rick Simpson, aplauz za našeg gosta. Hvala. Welcome. Stage is yours.
See if we get a microphone. How do we do? There. Okay, folks. I'd like to start off tonight with one of my favorite pieces of music. A man from California wrote this song about 7 or 8 years ago, and I think it's the greatest piece of music that was ever written about this wonderful plant. So we'll start with the song.
Food, fiber, oil, medicine, and fuel. But if the president sees, we won't have no need for any of the oil. We can make paints and leaks, we'll run our coffee, we'll back next season, it'll fix the soil. The most nutritious seed we can put in our mouth with omega-6 and 3. We can feed the world with the tree of life and live sustainably. But if we cut down all the trees, we won't have nowhere to breathe. Grow fields of hemp instead. We can make our paper, build a house from it. God's plan grown wild and free, living the way that we ought to be. Leave my children a better world than my ancestors left me. Medicines on earth. That was cancer and AIDS patients eat their food. Helps us with depression, overcome the blues. Glaucoma, apple, that's nausea, insomnia, stress, neurosis, psychosis, pain, PMS. All the studies have been done and all the doctors agree. But they can't make money off this plant, you see, because it's free. It grows from the seed, wild and free, like we ought to be. You know the future is going in our own backyards. If we cut down all the trees, we won't have nowhere to breathe. Grow fields of hemp instead. We can make our paper, build a house from it. God's plan grow wild and free, living the way that we ought to be. Gonna leave my children a better world. single plank that brings back almost 10,000 years of history. To the Shiva, Puranas, the Jesus, the Christ, the Buddha, the pagans, the goddess, the light, the commune with all the animals, commune with all the trees, to realize the goddess speakers inside me. The earth is a mother, we gotta take care of the earth. The earth is the mother that gives life birth, and we can heal our relation with a single green plant. We can start right now, pick up and down all the trees. We won't have nowhere to breathe. Grow fields of peppermint, we can make our faith, build a house from it. God's plan, go wild and free, living the way that we ought to be. Leave my children a better world than my ancestors left me. Whoa. Yeah, la 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 la. Whoa.
Well, isn't that a great piece of music? When I first heard this song, it amazed me because my dear friend Jack Hare, he fought this battle for 40 years, and when I heard that music and the way he did it, he put to music everything that Jack Hare and I have been preaching. So I think it should be a #1 hit. Now, I would like the folks here tonight to know that this is not, I'm not encouraging people to go break the laws. I am encouraging you to try to change the laws. You know, I mean, this medicine should be freely available to anyone who needs it. But this is presented for educational purposes. Now, I'll get on with my story. I don't know if we need any video for any clip of that. Okay. Well, back in 1969, my 22-year-old cousin was diagnosed with cancer. Now, he was a big, strong, strapping young man, and 3 years later, the cancer killed him. And I watched him go from 200 pounds down to about 50 pounds when he died. But the thing was, at that time, cancer was quite rare. I mean, I was about 23 years old when my cousin passed away, and he was the first person I ever knew that died from cancer. So it was quite rare. So about 2 years after my cousin had died, I worked at All Saints Hospital in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. And I got in my car this day, and I was leaving work, and I just turned the radio on, and this announcer was on there, and he was laughing like a fool, but he was saying that they had a report there. They didn't name the report at the time, but he said a medical report out of the United States indicated that THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, had been found to kill cancer cells. So where my cousin had just died, you know, it sunk in. It stayed in my memory. But time went on, and I never heard nothing more about any more research. There was no more mention of THC curing cancer. So I just thought it must have been a joke. But anyway, years later, in 1997, I was injured. I had a bad head injury at work. And it left me with what they call Post-Concussion Syndrome. My head rings 24 hours a day. It still does to this very day. But at least the oil helps control it when I have the oil. But with this type of illness, this type of injury, what they did, they put me on all of these different chemicals. And every one of the chemicals that the doctors prescribed me just made me worse. You know, I mean, it was just one pill after another, and I didn't know from day to day what I'd be taking next. But once we got about a year after I was injured, I was watching an episode of The Nature of Things with Dr. David Suzuki. It's a very popular show in Canada. And it was called Reefer Madness 2. But it showed all of these medical patients that were smoking hemp. And it was helping them with their medical conditions. You know, people suffering from spasms or many different things. Even smoking it will lower your blood sugar somewhat for diabetics. There are benefits to smoking, but it's the least medicinal way to use the substance. So after seeing the show, I went out and I purchased some hemp from local growers. And I tried it. And sure enough, it worked better than anything the medical system was giving me. You see, with this noise I had, I couldn't sleep. I needed something that would, would knock me out. And the marijuana, I mean, when I smoked marijuana, it did help me somewhat. But it still wasn't the ultimate answer. But still, it was better than anything the medical system, had given me. But I mean, I worked for the medical system myself for 25 years. So I had faith in the system. So I continued to take their pills, pill after pill after pill, and I got nothing but worse. So one day I was in my doctor's office in about 1999, and I said to him, because I'd asked these doctors for a prescription, so I could legally obtain the hemp, because in Canada they do have a marijuana access program. But they wouldn't give me a prescription. So, but in 1999, I asked my doctor one day, I said, because he always used excuses like, well, hemp is still under study, or it's bad for the lungs. And so one day I said to him, what would you think if I produced the essential oil from that plant and ingested it as a medication? Well, he told me, he said that would be much more medicinal. So, I mean, but still, he wouldn't give me a prescription, so I could go get the material. So, I mean, I stayed, even after that, I stayed with the medical system for 2 more years. In 2001, he called me into his office one day, and he said, there's nothing more we can do for you. We've given you all the chemicals. We've tried everything we know. It doesn't work. So you're on your own. Well, I mean, I worked for the system for 32 years. I had a government job. And this is the best they can do for me? You're on your own, and now you're a criminal because the only thing that helps you is the cannabis. So, I was pretty disgusted, with what I'd seen there. And so anyway, I went home, and I had nowhere to turn. So I started ingesting this oil. And believe me, in the beginning, it was kind of a scary experience because I didn't really know what this medicine would do. I knew that the hemp smoking it would relax you, but when you start ingesting the condensed oil, I wasn't too sure of this stuff. So I started taking little doses, and by the time the doctor had cut me loose, put simply, I couldn't even think straight. I mean, my coordination was bad. As a matter of fact, I couldn't leave the house without one of these. Now I use it as a pointer, or for self-defense. But anyway, when I turned to the hemp, it started helping me to sleep. It would literally knock me out at night. I could sleep like a baby. And in a very short time, people started seeing me. I was looking better. And my memory was coming back from all the damage the pills had. I mean, by the time I went off the chemical pills, I couldn't hardly remember my own name. That's how bad it was. So the oil started bringing my mind back. And then all of a sudden one day I realized that I no longer had arthritis. When I was 45 years old, I had arthritis in both knees. Well, no arthritis there. So this is another miracle that worked for me. And, well, there were several things. I mean, I started losing weight. I lost about 30 pounds, which is around 15 kilos. And the weight was just coming off me. And it scared me because I thought, it could take me down too far. But my weight reduced, and it brought me right back to a healthy weight. I mean, the stomach muscles and everything, just like when I was young. I don't do any exercises. But this oil, it brings you right back down to a healthy weight while it detoxifies you. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. I really had no idea of this medicine. And in the early days, when I first started to make this medicine, I had, well, first I should mention skin cancer, then I'll talk about the burn. But this was 2002, late 2002. I had these 3 areas on my skin. I had one by my eye, and I had one on my cheek, and I had one on my chest. So I went into the doctor, and they looked at it, and they said, it looks like skin cancer. And they were concerned about this one next to my eye. So I went in, they had it surgically removed, and then I was supposed to go back in at a later date to have the other 2 areas done. So it was about a week, I guess, after that I had the surgery done, I was looking at it one night in the mirror, and that report I'd heard back in the 1970s on the radio, it clicked back into my mind. You know, THC, the active ingredient in marijuana. Well, I'm making this oil, and I'm using it for sleeping. So I knew the oil would be full of THC, but I almost didn't put the oil on the cancer, because I thought, well, if this actually was true, you know, the oil I was eating would have cured the cancer. But the skin, you know, our skin is the biggest organ on our body. And in reality, the oil couldn't get in, or the cancer couldn't get into me, but it could survive on the surface. Because, you know, I just wasn't taking enough oil at that time. So anyway, I went down to the bathroom and I put a little bit of oil on this cancer and the one on my chest. And 4 days later, I never felt a thing. There was no sensation that anything was happening. 4 days later, I take the bandages off, and it's just pink skin. And I was just amazed. I mean, well, it's wonderful, but, you know, can this be true? And so I started telling friends of mine about, you know, what had happened. And they laughed at me. You know, the minute I said I cured my cancer with marijuana, it was like, you know, you're out to lunch. So it wasn't a very good scene. But about 7 weeks later, the cancer that they had surgically removed, it came roaring right back. And anybody that's ever had basal cell carcinoma, they know what it is. It feels like you have splinters in your face, in the affected area. And it swells up and bleeds. It's typical skin cancer. But, you know, after seeing the other two heal, I put the oil on it. When it came back, I put the oil on it. 4 days later, I removed the bandages. Now, that was over 8 years ago. I've never treated them since. So I knew, you know, I mean, they had done a pathology report when they had operated. So I went down to my doctor's office, and when I went in, I asked him for my pathology report, and his wife, it was actually his receptionist, the doctor's receptionist was his wife. And she passes me the report, and I read it, basal cell carcinoma, skin cancer. Well, then I knew that this oil had cured the cancer. So I knew the doctor I had, my family doctor, I knew him quite well. So I said to his wife, I said, you know, I'd like to come back in the evening and have a talk with Dave about something I'm working on. And she said, what would this be about? And I said, well, those other two cancers I had, I said, I cured those with hemp oil. And then the one that came back, or the one that they had surgically removed, came back, so I cured it too. Now, I was standing in my doctor's waiting room, and there was like 5 or 6 other people there. And his secretary, she just went like this. The doctor will not go there. The doctor will not prescribe this. And I'm standing there, you know, I cured my own cancer, and you don't want to know? You know, it was like the Twilight Zone. So, anyway, it was a long drive home that day. But right after I got back to Spring Hill, or just outside of Spring Hill where I live, you know, I had many friends that had conditions, things that wouldn't heal. You know, diabetic ulcers and infections and that type of thing. And other people with skin cancer. So, what I did, I started supplying the oil to people free of charge. I was growing the plants and producing the medicine, and more people came to take it. Excuse me. Gotta have my cold break. Now, I never hid anything, about this, because I did not consider what I was doing to be a criminal activity. You know, when you're making a natural, harmless medicine and you're giving it to people to help them, is that a crime? So, I started a campaign in 2003 to bring this to the attention of the proper authorities. So the first one I went to was Dr. David Suzuki, because it was his show that had actually led me in that direction. Okay. But when I contacted them, there was no interest. And actually I contacted them twice. And I even offered to send them some oil so they could do their own assessment at the Suzuki Foundation. But they said that they weren't a research facility. You know, I mean, you don't need research with this oil. You just take it and put it on. We'll find somebody with a diabetic ulcer or skin cancer or that type of thing, or a bad burn, and put the oil on and it heals them. And you can see it in no time. Now that one, I forgot about the burn, so I have to go back to that. Well, right after I cured my own cancer, my own skin cancer, it was about that time that it all kind of clicked in place. And it was really startling when I started to realize what I had discovered with this oil. Because in the early days when I first started to make the oil, I was still having the effects of the chemical medications. So one day when I tried to make the oil, I caught myself on fire. And I mean, I caught myself on fire, severe burn. My whole right hand, 3/4 of it had melted. And it was just hanging in big gobs. And I mean, 3rd-degree burns are nasty. So I had put it in a bucket of water, and my girlfriend came down, and she as soon as she wanted to see it, so I pulled it out. And I know this sounds horrible, but it's totally painless. But all of these gobs that were hanging, she just took a pair of scissors and cut them off, because you couldn't feel it. But the strange thing was, I was still having so much effect from the chemicals that were in my body, from the medical system, I didn't even notice what was taking place. But within 11 days, that hand completely healed, leaving no scars. There's not a scar in that hand. And at that point, I was so full of chemicals, I said, well, I must be a good healer. It just didn't even click what this oil had done. But right after I cured my own skin cancer, that's when I realized what this medicine could do. Or I was beginning to realize what it could do. So right after I contacted Dr. Suzuki, and of course they did nothing, then I started contacting, I went to the Minister of Health in Canada, I went to all the political parties, I went to the Canadian Cancer Society, everywhere you could think to go. So, I just didn't know where else to turn. And finally, we even went to the United Nations about this. Nobody would look into it. So it was very frustrating, believe me. But as time went on, more and more people kept coming, to me for help, and I just kept making the oil and giving it to them. And in 2004, I went to our local newspaper in Spring Hill, and they did a full-page article detailing everything I did. It's like, as I said, I didn't hide it. But no police came near or anything, but a lot more people came looking for help. So I just continued treating them. And then in the spring of 2005, I had, it was in 2004 that I actually started treating people, or supplying the oil to people, so they could use it for internal cancers. And the results we got were magnificent. So the bartender at the local Legion branch, he had heard about what I was doing. His name was Rick DeWire. And he wanted to meet me. So I went over and talked to him, and he said, would you mind if I came with you? When you're doing, I'd like to meet these patients you're talking about. Well, actually, he knew some of them. So he came with me. I remember the first night he went with me. That was it. Because he's seen that once you see the proof with your own eyes, you can't deny it. And especially when they're people that you actually know. You know they had this condition. So Rick was totally amazed with it all, and we decided that we would have a meeting at the local Legion branch, open to the public, and I would bring patients in. And I'm a veteran's son. My father fought in the invasion of Normandy. So, and the Royal Canadian Legion is supposed to stand for the rights of the children of veterans. Well, actually, they're supposed to stand for the rights of all Canadians. But anyway, we decided we'd have this meeting, so we had the meeting. I think about 45 or 50 people attended, and we had about a dozen people there that had used the oil for different conditions. And just like I said, the results were just fabulous. So we took a videotape of that meeting, and we sent it out to W5. Now these are shows in Canada that are quite popular. W5, the 5th Estate, and we sent a copy to David Suzuki, The Nature of Things, but we never heard a word. Nobody did a thing. So as time went on, I started to realize, like when I didn't get any reply back, you know, from the RCMP, or excuse me, when I didn't get any reply back from all of these different political people I had talked to, and I got no reply back from, well, no reply from David Suzuki, that was for sure. But, you know, I just thought someone out there had to be honest enough to do something about this. And by the spring of 2004, I was beginning to realize that they didn't want a cure. They didn't want to help us. So by that time, there were so many people coming to me that I just continued producing the medicine. And I just thought that soon the system would regain their sanity, you know, and allow this to take place. So after we had shot the video, as I said, we sent that out in many different directions to the news, or to, you know, these information shows. And then I took a copy of it, because right on the video, that when we made it, I told the public, the audience that day, that I was going to grow it right in my backyard. I mean, why should I run through the woods and try to hide this? I had a nice open hillside in my backyard, so I was going to grow it right in my backyard and provide the medicine to the people. But as I said, I wasn't charging. So I took a copy of the same tape, the same video, I took it into the RCMP, I gave it to them, and I asked them if I could have what they confiscated, so I could make more medicine. But no, they didn't say. All I talked to was a receptionist. But 3 months later, I never heard a word from these people. Then 3 months later, the same detachment came and raided me. And I mean, I just found it unbelievable. And the worst of it is, one of the Mounties, one of the RCMP officers that were there that day, they said to me that, you know, because I was very mad when I seen the plants being taken. And, you know, they said to me, we believe everything you're saying. Well, I said, if you believe everything that I'm telling you, then what are you doing? You know, you're tearing the cure for cancer out of the ground. You know, this is medicine. Didn't make any difference. So I was taken, I was arrested, I was charged with cultivation, trafficking, and possession. But I still had it in my head that sooner or later these people would wise up. So my first day in court, I took a video in, the video from the meeting, I took that in, and when I had taken the video to the RCMP 3 months before I was raided, we had videotaped that too, because I really didn't trust the police. So I took all this information in, and I gave it to the Crown Prosecutor. And I told him, I said, this is something that, this doesn't belong in a court of law. This is medicine, you know, this is working wonderful miracles for people. But it didn't make any difference. They continued on with their nonsense, you know, like, you grew it, you know, well, they call it trafficking. Even if you just pass a joint in Canada, that's trafficking. But I was giving the oil away, so to them, that was trafficking. It was disgusting. So then in 2006, I went ahead and I planted my backyard again. Another 1,100 plants in my backyard. And of course, they came in again. This time, they didn't arrest me. They just said, we're with the marijuana eradication program, and they took the plants. They never even had a search warrant. They never went through my house. So I was getting truly disgusted with it, because there were so many people coming to me then, because the papers had written some articles. So, you know, people were looking for help. So then I had to turn to other underground growers to supply what we needed to produce the medicine for people. But it just continued on, one miracle after another. And, you know, I honestly believed in 2003, when I started doing this, I really thought they wanted a cure. I mean, they told us all our lives, you know, we want the cure for cancer. We want preventative medicine. Well, this is preventative medicine. It's the greatest preventative medicine on this planet, because it's harmless. But that went on anyway, and then finally, well, the court system decided to keep pulling me into their courts, and they suggested that I should mount a charter challenge. Well, in Canada, we have what you call the Charter of Rights. And under the Charter of Rights, you have the right to life. But as I was to find out, you have the right to life as long as you're not going to use a hemp plant to heal yourself. Because under those circumstances, you don't have the right to life anymore. They won't let you have it. So it was a pretty sad experience. But I went out and I put out 120 affidavits. I gathered 48 affidavits finally. And that's when I really started to figure out more what the human race was really about. Because I had treated so many people by that time that I thought I would get all the affidavits back. But I had quite a time. Finally, I did get 48 out of 120. And there was people I went to for an affidavit that I cured their cancer. And they told me they didn't want to get involved. So there's your human race. That's what's wrong. It's like we're all getting this self-centered way of life. You know, well, thanks for curing me, but I don't care if anybody else has the right to the medication. Well, I mean, that was a pretty rude awakening. And then I ran, we had a federal election came up that year, so I ran in the federal election as an independent under the banner of curing, with this, curing people's cancer with this medicine from this plant. The audiences, when I spoke, they just kind of sat there and looked at me. Is he telling the truth? But nobody was disputing anything I said. Because you can't dispute this. It's as plain as the nose on your face. The medicine works. And it's the same when I go to any of these things, these events, or if I'm speaking on an interview on radio or whatever. I always tell people, don't believe a single word I'm saying. Simply go out, get about 30 grams of good hemp bud, produce the essential oil, find somebody with a diabetic ulcer or skin cancer or severe burn, put the oil on, put a bandage on, watch what happens. So anybody can prove this. Well, anyway, needless to say, I didn't get elected. I got 524 votes, I believe it was. But I had gone through, when we finally did get into the charter challenge, it was crazy what they did, because I had 48 sworn affidavits, and the judge just said, well, these are anecdotal. Well, what's anecdotal about affidavits about something that has been used as a medicine for 5,000 years? What's anecdotal about that? Hemp's always been medicine. But no, anecdotal, doesn't matter. And then the judge turned around and said that I didn't present any life-threatening condition. So he's telling me suddenly now that skin cancer isn't life-threatening. Well, I got news for him. It's very life-threatening. So, there's a lot of people dying from skin cancer too. And also he said, like my post-concussion syndrome. Well, that doesn't threaten your life. Well, when you have what I have, this type of injury, you can't control your blood pressure. It goes up and down. It's terrible. And there's a lot of problems associated with an injury like that are life-threatening. But by that time, I was just fed up. So when we went back into the court, they said, well, you can appeal your charter challenge decision. But I had already seen enough. I knew these people were corrupt. So I just said, I want this to go back into the main court system in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia, and I want a jury to hear this case. But anyway, that's what happened. Finally, they brought us into the court, and the jury did hear the case, but they wouldn't let me present my evidence. Now, I had 10 patients at my trial, 10 patients. Some of them had been cured of terminal cancers. I had them there ready to testify. I also had 6 doctors there ready to testify. They wouldn't let them on the stand. They said it had no bearing on my case. So it tells you right there they weren't looking too hard for a cure for cancer, were they? But I still thought, no matter what, I still had all of these. We'd done a lot of research, into this to find out as much as we could about it. So I had boxes full of research papers. But again, they wouldn't let us introduce it as evidence. And so the only one that was left to testify on my behalf was me. So I took the stand for about 2 hours, and I explained to people exactly, what I had done. And, and they said, well, what would you do? If you found a cure for cancer, who would you go to? Wouldn't you do the things that I did? So, that part of it was, it's really disturbing. When you realize it just seems that no one cares. Until they're the ones with the cancer, then they care. But, let's see. After I was done speaking that day, I was on the stand for about 2 hours. And by the time I was done speaking, everybody in the audience, there was only a few people there, they were sure that I had won the case hands down. Because even when the Mounties had testified against me, I said, I brought up the article they had done in the paper. I asked these police officers when they were on the stand, I said, would a criminal go to a newspaper and have a full-page article done with his picture and everything? Criminals don't do that. So they had to admit it right in front of the jury that this was not criminal behavior. But it didn't make any difference. So finally, when the case was finally over, the jury was sequestered. And they were only about 3 hours they were out. And we got the call to come back, and they said that, the jury's ready with a verdict. And I was sure that we had won. I couldn't imagine anything else. But, so when I went back into the courtroom that day, there was 2 prosecutors. There was Monica McQueen. She was the prosecutor from the Justice Department. She was the one that did most of the talking. And then there was a Crown prosecutor from Amherst named Doug Shatford. He actually sat there through the whole case and didn't open his mouth. But when I came back into the courtroom that day, he was missing. McQueen was there, but Shatford wasn't. So 3 or 4 minutes later, Shatford comes in and sits down. And when I stood up, to take the verdict, it was like, guilty, guilty, guilty. And I'm standing there thinking, guilty of what? Saving people's lives? Am I a criminal because I help people? It was just unimaginable. But the jury, they were acting very strangely. When they left that day, they were walking with their heads way down. And I just couldn't imagine what had taken place. So it was the very next day, the lady that was in the audience, Margaret Dwyer, she calls me up on the phone and she said, should the Crown prosecutor be leaving the jury room? And I said, what? And she said, well, Rick, she said, I seen him leave the jury room about 3 minutes before the jury came in with your verdict. And I was like, oh, this can't be true. I said, Margaret, go back to the courthouse, tell them you lost a stone out of your ring. And make sure of what you're saying, because jury tampering is a very serious charge. So she went right back to the exact seat she was sitting in, and she told me, she said, when I looked down the hallway, there was only one room, only one doorway I can see. And that's the jury room door. And she said, I seen the Crown prosecutor exit that door 3 minutes before they came in with your verdict. So we called the judge to tell him, what are we going to do? So they never said anything about another court case. They just told us to appear in Amherst 2 weeks later. So Mrs. Dwyer and myself, we went up to Amherst, and when we walked in, there was a judge, Judge Cascione sitting on the bench. Here was the 2 prosecutors, and they had some pasty-faced lawyer from Halifax representing them. And then the judge said to Mrs. Dwyer, he said, I hope you know that if you're caught in a lie in this court, that you could go to jail for 14 years for perjury. Margaret Dwyer, she never batted an eye. She just said, look, I'm here to tell the truth, and she took the stand. Well, the lawyers went at her, and they tried to defrock what she was saying. But they couldn't. Margaret Dwyer is one of the most truthful people I've ever met. And at the end of it, they couldn't disprove a thing. So, but the judge still said, he said, I think this is something that you and Mrs. Dwyer cooked up to derail your sentencing. So, there was no question they were out to hang me. But it was about that time, I guess it was about 2 months later, just before my sentencing, that we released the documentary Run from the Cure. which made the legal system a bit uncomfortable because that put the information out to a lot of people. But the day of my sentencing, when I went to be sentenced, it was the strangest thing, because the judge was sitting there and he said, in my 34 years in the legal system, he said, I've never seen a case like this. There was no criminal intent. And the people in the audience that day, they clapped. I thought we were all going to get arrested. And then he turned right around, and although they wouldn't let me introduce the scientific evidence, when the court case was going on, he turned right around and said, the scientific evidence does exist to back up everything he's saying. So I was thinking, this is just getting better and better. And then he turned and he said, well, of course, I had all these patients. And he knew that there was many of them right in the courtroom. And he said he has all these patients. And they too back his position. Now, I was facing 12 years in jail. It's up to the judge's discretion. But what they did, they gave me a $2,000 fine and a gun restriction. Now, there wasn't even a gun in my house. The only people waving guns around were police. But they never even put me on probation. But and I think really the only reason that I got the fine is because I kept telling the judge off. I mean, what these people were doing in that courtroom was so outrageous. They knew that we had a cure here, and they were working with the system to hold it back. And I remember one time I said to the judge, before this is over, I said, you're the one that's going to be going to jail. You people are criminals. And so, I mean, they didn't like some of my comments. I remember another one, they said, one point there, they said, well, Mr. Simpson, you can't take this personally. And I got right out of the chair and I said, take it personally? I said, because of those raids in 2005, 2006, people had died. Do I take that personally? You're damn right I do. And the judge, down goes his head. Couldn't look me in the face. That's the Canadian legal system. And I hope yours is better. But at that point, once I was done with the court case, I was really sickened with Canada. I was looking to go to another country where I might find some freedom. And but what happened is people just kept coming. I was having dozens and dozens of people. There was times there was like 6 and 8 cars in my yard. Everybody needing the medicine. And so, I mean, it really had taken the wind out of my sails going through the medical or through the court system. But I just continued on. I was still thinking, sooner or later these people have to wise up. But of course they never do. But anyway, there were so many things going on. Finally, I couldn't supply the medicine to everyone because I was buying up everything within a 50-mile radius of my home. All the good hemp, I was buying it up. And all the people that wanted to smoke it were mad at me. Well, he bought up all the good pot. But I had a much better reason than they had. So it just continued to expand and expand. And I had police officers coming to me. I treated police officers and their families. So like I said, there was nothing hidden. And then people over here in Europe, I mean, I was doing seminars in Canada. I would take my own vehicle, drive hundreds of miles and go do seminars to try to get the message out. And then some people in the Czech Republic got wind of what I was doing in 2009. So they turned around and they asked me if I'd be willing to come over and do a speaking tour in the Czech Republic. And that would have been October of 2009. So I said, certainly. And so it was arranged that Dr. Lemire Hanoush was to do the tour with me. Now, Dr. Hanoush is one of the greatest experts in this field in the world. He discovered anandamide back in the 1980s. He works with Dr. Mollisham at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Mollisham discovered THC. So these are the top guys in their field. So Lemire and I, we spoke at several different functions together. But we didn't get the crowds we thought we would get. But we did get, sometimes there was a decent crowd, but I remember one point, we spoke at the medical school in Olomouc, in the Czech Republic. Now, the medical school in Olomouc is one of the oldest medical schools in Europe. So Dr. Hanous spoke, and then I spoke, and then when I came down off the stage, this young medical student walked up to me. And she looked at me and she said, "You're calling doctors murderers." And I said, "Well, dear, if I give somebody poison and they die from its effects, what would you call me?" And then I looked at her and I said, "Does it make a difference if you're wearing a white coat?" And then you could tell she became very angry. And she looked at me and she said, "The medical faculty of this university wants you back here on the 26th of this month, and they're going to set you straight." Well, of course, that's all it took. I said, "You get every doctor in the Czech Republic here on the 26th, and we'll see who gets set straight." So the people that were putting on the tour, Baron Ramsey Hemp Cosmetics, they got excited when they heard this. Because they thought, you know, well, if the university takes me on, then the news media will get involved. But when I talked to Gingrich Bear, I told him, I said, "Gingrich, they're not going to take me on." And he said, "Well, they just said they were." And I said, "I don't care what they said. You know," I said, "there's no possible way they can take me on because I'm the only one that's telling the truth." And, well, 3 days later, the medical school called up and canceled. They decided it wasn't a good idea. So that, I mean, it's not that they don't know, but they're resisting the change. That's the problem. And, well, right after that, we did the tour in October. I went back to Canada, made medicine as fast as I could for 3 weeks, and then I came back to the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam. And they made me Freedom Fighter of the Year in 2009. But while I was in Amsterdam, I got a call from my son that the Mountie, the RCMP, had raided my house again. Well, there was nothing in my house. You know, all the medicine had been made, distributed. There was nothing left except some compost in the backyard. Because that's what I do with the material. Once it's done, I wash the resin off it and dump it in the backyard. So, when my son called me, I said, "Well, what are they saying?" And he said, "They're saying that they found 70 pounds of hemp or marijuana in your house." Well, I knew that was ridiculous. And then they said they found weapons, restricted weapons. Well, the only weapon in my house was a kid's pellet gun, which is hardly restricted. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I realized what they were doing, they were trying to frame me, or to make it so that I couldn't return to Canada because I was getting such a following there. There were so many people knew that I was telling the truth about all this, and more people were coming. So I think their idea really was to keep me out of Canada. Well, it worked. I've been here now for 17 months, and it's been a real adventure over here in Europe, just seeing these different countries and meeting all the different people, and I've met some great people over here. But I've spread the word in every country I've been in. I've spoke to governments. As a matter of fact, I'm going on within the next week or two. I'll be speaking to the Slovenian government about this. But the governments are interested now, and they know the medicine is coming because they know it works, and you can't keep it from the people. Because like when Christian Lorette made that, when he made the Run from the Cure, well, that showed everybody, you know, how to make your own medicine. And I have to give Christian Lorette a lot of credit because the man made that video with a camcorder and a computer that blew up every 15 minutes. So I don't know how he did it, but he did a great job. And I think it was mostly his efforts that kept me out of jail, really. But right at the present time, I mean, we're looking at. Excuse me, just one sec. What's this up here for? Oh, we're not going to get into that yet. All right. This is the first time with PowerPoint, so I'm not so sure. I probably should be running it myself. But the governments over here are awakening to the fact that this medicine is coming. The National Cancer Institute in the United States, they just put up on their website, that's at www.gov, it's the government website, that cannabinoids have antitumor effects, which means they cure cancer, or kill cancer. But it's just, it's so crazy when you look at these things, like The study I heard in about 1975, that was the Medical School of Virginia study. And the government, I mean, that study was hidden. It was 36 years ago that this study was on the radio. So they've known for 36 years how to cure cancer. But the American government and the Canadian government had this plant listed as a non-medicinal plant. Now, I find that very strange because now, if you look it up, the American government since 2003 have had medical patents on that plant. Medical patents for a non-medicinal plant? Does that make any sense to you? It's just a big ugly game that they're playing with us and our health. And it has to come to an end. And we're going to see that it does. Well, and another thing I should have mentioned too. This medicine is not just about humans. It's about animals too. Like we've treated many dogs with cancers. It works for all animals because they all have cannabinoid receptors in their bodies. Actually, I love treating dogs because they have a fast metabolism, and a dog will heal in no time. I've seen dogs that were dying of terminal cancer within a week cured, right back to normal. So, you know, it's something that it's not just about the human race. It's about all the species that live on this planet. It can promote much better health. All right. Now, back about 2004, after I had been in touch with everyone, I really started to wake up to what the system was doing. You know, I started watching documentaries like Loose Change, and I started listening to the work of people like David Icke, Alex Jones, Jesse Ventura. And what they were doing, it had a profound effect on me because it went hand in hand with what I've seen with the medical system, or the medical industry, the corruption, the lies. And, you know, and people like, you know, David Icke and Jesse Ventura, well, they say, oh, okay, or even me, they say, oh, these people are conspiracy theorists. No, we're not. We're just people that are awake and we can actually see what's going on around us. But most people go through life and they don't take the time to think about it, about what really is being done to them. So this, believe me, you can call it a conspiracy if you want, but this thing is real. And it's killing you and it's killing your loved ones. So we have to bring it to an end. Now, actually, people, you know, there are actually people like David Icke and Alex Jones and these people that are trying to bring the truth out. I mean, their only wish is to bring the truth to the attention of the public. You know, before we do any more damage to ourselves and this beautiful planet that we call home. The conspiracy that I'm speaking about is real, and I hope before you leave here tonight that you can grasp the truth in what I'm saying. So I'll discuss my criminal status now. They did convict me in Canada. I do have a criminal record because of what I did, which makes it awkward because there's places like I can't go to the United States. You can't get into the States. There's different countries that I can't go now. So it kind of restricts me a bit, but I can travel freely here in the EU and in Croatia and different countries in this area. So that's what I've been doing for the past few months.
Ja se ispričavam. Javio sam samo iz hotela da poručimo Rijeka 901 OL. Crna Ibiza smeta negdje gdje je. Jeste se prepoznali u tome? Ako ste se prepoznali, molim, reagirajte. Excuse me, we had some car on the bad place.
It's okay. That explains it.
Continue, thanks.
I guess we can continue. Well, as I said, I mean, the Canadian government made me a criminal, for the crime of helping others who were suffering and dying. When you live in a country that persecutes you for such behavior, in truth, you are not living in much of a country. I can honestly say that I am no longer proud to call myself a Canadian. And to me, the country of my birth has become little more than a police state. Because that's really what it is. In Canada, we are told that we are living in a democracy and that we have rights and freedoms. But in reality, we have no rights, and the only freedom you have is to do as you're told. That's not freedom. My father was badly wounded in World War II fighting for democracy and freedom, but the Canada he was fighting for no longer upholds the values on which it was founded. So I feel that the Canadian people will never really know freedom until they rid themselves of the corruption that has ruined their way of life. I have no plans to return to Canada, and perhaps I never will, unless the people of Canada stand up and take their rights back. And if they do, Canada may once again become a decent place to live. But at present, I don't want no part of Canada. Now I'm going to give you a brief history of him and how it became illegal. Yeah, I can do that. Am I getting anybody's way if I do this over here? Yeah. Well, I could point at it then. I gotta use this stick. Okay. Now we're going back to 8000 BC. Civilization, agriculture, and hemp textile industries begin in Asia and Europe. 2800 BC, called the superior herb in the world's first medical text. And that was in ancient China, 2800 years before Christ. 700 BC, the ancient Persian religious text, the Vedas. They listed the most medicinal plants known to man at that time. The number one plant, cannabis, and it still is. All right, 1000 BC, well, there's the story on hemp medicine, how much it was used. 1000 BC to 1900 AD, hemp extracts are the number 1, 2, and 3 most important and most frequently used medicine for 2/3 of the world's people. Is hemp not medicine? Then we get the Chinese, they invented paper, 1100 BC. And then we have the birth of Christ. Now, I'm not a religious person, but if there was a healer walking around this planet 2,000 years ago named Jesus Christ, I have a feeling he was using him to work the medical miracles. Because it was widely known. I mean, it had been in medicine for thousands of years at that time. And it was the only medicine people had. Because there was no trauma centers or no big pharmaceutical companies. They used nature to heal themselves. Okay. And this is another case where religion gets involved. 1000 to 1600 AD, approximate period of the Roman Catholic Inquisition. A time in Western Europe when 10 to 33% of the entire population was tortured or put to death for owning a dinner fork, taking a bath, or using cannabis as medicine. So the church stood against it. Now that part I find very strange. How could a church stand against a God-given plant? Wasn't it God that put the plant here? But yet a religion stands, and they're not the only religion. I mean, they all do. They all seem to act the same. Now there's Joan of Arc, for example, during 1430 to 31, Joan of Arc was accused of using cannabis and other herbs as a religious sacrament. Very serious crime. 1470, Gutenberg Bible printed on hemp paper. 1619, America's first law is enacted in Jamestown Colony, Virginia, ordering all farmers to grow hemp. Because they needed it in those days. It was used for, they made canvas, that's where we get canvas. The ropes, the Bibles, they had to have the hemp supplies for their navies. And plus it was widely used as a food source. 1776, first and second drafts of the Declaration of Independence are written on hemp paper. Now, I'll go ahead here a little bit, and I want to go back to George Washington. In 1842 to 1890, extracts and derivatives of the hemp plant are the second and third most prescribed medicines in the USA. E.I. Lilly, Parker Davis, Squibb Brothers, and other firms produce these medicines through the 1890s. Well, actually, they produced them right through until the 1930s. I don't know how that got there. Little mistake. But something I wanted to mention here is, like people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these were the founding fathers of the United States of America. They were hemp farmers. George Washington is very well recorded that George Washington used to like to sit out on his veranda at night and smoke his hemp in his pipe. Now, these are the same people that authored these wonderful documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. So it appears that the hemp didn't affect their thinking abilities. And if they had lived up, if they had stood, by the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the United States would be a much better country than it is today. But George Washington himself, as I said, he had a hemp plantation. But George got a bad case of streptococcus. And streptococcus is nasty stuff, although hemp oil will take care of it quite easily. But at that time, they didn't know this, so the good doctors came in to save George. So George is laying there in bed, and they come in and they drained half his blood. Now, surprisingly, that didn't heal him. So the next day, they gave him mercury. Well, that finished the job. It's just so insane. And it was only actually 100 years, or just over 100 years later, 150 years later, that they're outlawing this and telling the public all of these lies about it. It's medicine. And if George had used it, he'd still be with us. Okay. Now, it's like I said, now here's another thing with like E.I. Lilly, Parker Davis, Squibb, all of these companies that produce this medicine. Now, back in the mid-1800s, it was common practice for drug companies to produce the essential oils from many different herbs and spices, or herbs and medicinal plants. They produced the essential oil, they sold them to the public as medicine. Now, where cannabis had been known for thousands of years to be the most medicinal plant, then of course they're going to make the essential oil from it, aren't they? Well, I've done all kinds of research on this. I've never been able to find any pharmaceutical company that ever actually supplied the real essential oil from the plant. What they did, they supplied it in tincture form. A little bit of oil with alcohol. Or E.I. Lilly, they sold pain. They're hash pills. They sold them as painkillers in the 1880s. So, I don't like. The only thing I can see here, I honestly think that these pharmaceutical companies had to know, because the minute you boil the alcohol, the oil, you're producing the same stuff that I make, and what I've been doing all the healing with. So if these pharmaceutical companies manufactured this stuff worldwide for years, and they didn't know that, then they deserve a PhD in stupid. All right, now let's get to the marital pleasures. 1890s, popular American marriage guides recommend cannabis extracts for heightened marital pleasures. Women's temperance groups lobbying for alcohol prohibition suggest cannabis as a suitable substitute for the demon drink. I agree. Okay. Well, that's George and Thomas, yeah. All right. Now, I should mention here, in the 1880s, pharmaceutical companies began to put their chemicals together. If you combine certain types of chemicals, then you can patent that, and you can sell it as a drug. So they couldn't patent hemp at the time, so that's the route they wanted to go down, where something they could charge whatever they wanted for. Because hemp was just, well, I think they were actually terrified, because if the farmers had to realize what they were, like farmers everywhere in the world were freely growing hemp. Here in Europe, in North America, if those farmers had found out that they were growing the most wonderful healing plant, and you could make this magnificent medicine from it, how long would the farmers, or how long would the drug companies be in business? They would have been gone. So their aim was really to get rid of the dreaded marijuana plant. Well, it wasn't called marijuana then; it was still called hemp or cannabis. But their aim was to get rid of this plant and take it away from public use. And then in 1898, the Hearst newspaper announced Spaniards, Mexican Americans, and Latinos after the seizure by the Mexican government of 800,000 acres of prime Hearst-owned timberland in Mexico by the marijuana-smoking army of Pancho Villa. Vigorous slander of the Mexican people continues in Hearst and other publications for 3 decades because of Hearst's personal prejudice against the African Americans and Hispanics. Hearst's covert motivations to link them with the proliferation of an evil drug, the term marijuana, a word totally unfamiliar to the average hemp-loving American citizen, is used to exclusively identify the cannabis, throughout this public disinformation campaign. See, the people didn't know what marijuana was. The farmers knew what hemp was, but when they changed the name, and then Hearst is telling everybody, you know, this dreaded new drug, the killer weed, assassin of youth. If one of your children smoke marijuana, they'll come home and they'll kill the family. You ever see anybody fight on marijuana? Anybody, like, I've seen a lot of people out there drunk, and yeah, they'll get the fist fight pretty quick. I never seen anybody fight when they were smoking hemp. But again, like I said, this is not about the smoking side of things. So anyway, Hearst was spreading it was called yellow journalism. And believe me, it was yellow. And then it doesn't say here, but in 1916, a German, invented the decorticator. And that was a machine that could process hemp and take all the back-breaking labor because to take the fiber out for making clothes and that type of thing. Okay, can you go to the next one? Well, again, back to Pancho Villa and his first use of the word. Now, this gentleman comes into play. John D. Rockefeller. About 1906, Mr. Rockefeller and his rich friends got together and they decided they would start medical foundations. So, they had the money to do whatever they wanted. So they went out and they started teaching people, when they opened these universities and things, they taught allopathic medicine. Medicine from chemicals. Well, chemicals don't heal you. But this is what they taught because Mr. Rockefeller, his friends owned the chemical companies. And so they had a vested interest in pushing their products. Now, empiric medicine, medicine from plants, was very popular at that time. But they just pushed the empiric medicine aside, outlawed it, and went ahead with the allopathic medicine. So people like Mr. Rockefeller, they're the ones that are largely responsible for the medical system we have today. But old John D. himself, he lived to be 98 years old. Guess what medicine he used? It wasn't allopathic. Okay. 1916 to 1935, the Hearst newspapers initiate and build a campaign to outlaw marijuana. Reporting is slanted to generate reader bias. For example, the reader was never told that hemp and marijuana are exactly the same plant. Nor was the reader told that the active ingredients of the tonic they gave their baby to ease colic came from marijuana or the hemp plant. nor that the smoke they inhaled in their ever-popular hashish parlors was a derivative of marijuana. Furthermore, news stories are manipulated to aggrandize and exaggerate the supported horrors of recreational marijuana use. Now that was if you look into history, back in the early part of the 1900s, in New York City alone, there was 500 hash parlors where people could openly go in, smoke hash. Well, hash is made from the same material, the resin of the plant. It's the same material that I make the medicine from. So it was widely accepted at that time. Okay, 1930, U.S. government sponsors the Siller Commission, study on the effects of off-duty smoking of marijuana, hemp buds and leaves by American servicemen in Panama. The report concludes that such recreational smoking is not a problem and recommends that no criminal penalties apply to its use. During the same time, Louis Armstrong was arrested and jailed for 10 days for smoking marijuana cigarettes. There's that smoke. But it was very much, it was a racial thing that they did. They used people like Louis Armstrong so badly. I mean, he was a wonderful musician, but when they played that racist card, they generated the hate they were looking for. Okay, can we go to the next one? All right. 1931, Andrew Mellon and the powerful Mellon Bank of Pittsburgh, financier of the many DuPont projects and longtime supporter of Hearst, serving as President Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury, appoints his future nephew-in-law, Harry J. Anslinger, to be the head of the newly reorganized Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger begins to compile a dossier of tabloid articles which sensationalize first day of my new lips, disinformation about marijuana use, and the crimes committed while supposedly under the influence of the herb. This collection of newspaper clippings, most from Hearst newspapers, becomes known as the Gore Files. 1937, Walter Treadway, Assistant U.S. Surgeon General, tells the Cannabis Advisory Subcommittee of the League of Nations that extended use of cannabis derivatives is benign. In other words, harmless, both socially and economically, and is no more habit-forming than sugar or coffee. I like this illustration. You know, good plant, bad plant. I think they got that mixed up. And there's the wonder of reefer madness. There it is before your eyes. You know, they made these, well actually there was a lot of sensationalist writing done on this subject. Right in Canada alone, there was a woman called Emily F. Murphy. And she wrote, she was a judge. And she wrote a series of articles for Maclean's magazine about marijuana. I don't think the woman had ever been within 1,000 miles of a marijuana plant, because again, it was just more of the sensationalist, racist. If a black man smokes marijuana, then he'll rape a white woman, that type of thing. So, and then she produced a book called The Black Candle. It was more of the same nonsense. And then in 1923, the Canadian government makes Indian hemp illegal. In the year 1900, 2/3 of the medicine made worldwide was coming from that plant. 23 years later, the Canadian government outlawed medicinal use. And then in 1930s, 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act. Well, essentially that took it off the farmers couldn't grow it anymore. There was just too many difficulties, and you couldn't get They wanted the hemp plant gone. And they did a great job of erasing it. Here's a very friendly man. He's got a sledgehammer in his hand. Henry Ford, he was interested in running cars on alcohol. And he was also very interested in hemp fiber. So he built a car out of hemp. It was 2/3 the weight of steel and 10 times stronger. And there's some very famous footage. This isn't in the winter here, but there's some very famous footage of him doing the same thing in the wintertime He has his sledgehammer and he's hitting the back of this car. He can't even put a dent in it. Now, why aren't we driving hemp cars? Or why don't we have hemp boats, hemp airplanes? You know, 2/3 the weight of steel, 10 times stronger. To me, it just makes sense. But anyway, that got crushed. Did I get next clip? Okay, 1942, the U.S. government overrides its own ban on hemp and distributes 400,000 pounds of hemp seed to U.S. farmers who produce 42,000 tons of hemp fiber annually to support the war effort until 1946. U.S. farmers, including youthful 4-H club members, are inundated by Uncle Sam with incentives to grow hemp. The USDA makes it mandatory for farmers to attend showings of its Hemp for Victory film. Farmers and their sons who agree to grow hemp are exempt from military service, even though America is at war. Well, see, what happened, they outlawed the hemp in the States. They outlawed people growing it because they were getting their hemp supply from the Philippines. And when the Japanese when they invaded the Philippines, that cut off the hemp supply. So then the American government had to turn around and produce this film, Hemp for Victory. And, you know, it was okay to grow hemp again, as long as it's for the war effort. And this gentleman here, Mr. LaGuardia, he was the mayor of New York. And as I said, in New York there used to be 500 hash parlors. So they knew there was no harm. So the LaGuardia report, marijuana report, compiled between 1938 and 1944 by the New York Academy of Medicine at the request of Mayor Theodore LaGuardia, is released to refute Anslinger's negative claims about marijuana. It reports that marijuana use has caused no violence at all and cites numerous instances of beneficial effects. 1950s and 1960s. I should mention first, okay, we'll read this first. The U.S. Army sponsored numerous tests to determine the effects of cannabis smoking on soldiers. The first study showed no loss of motivation or performance after 2 years of continual heavy smoking. The study is replicated 6 more times by the U.S. military and dozens of times by independent universities, always with the same basic findings. Now, Anslinger, he kept busy. At first he outlawed hemp because it was so dangerous and it caused so much violence. Then he changed his tune in the early 1950s, and he said it makes people into pacifists. That's a kind of a radical shift. But Anslinger went to the United Nations in 1954, and he had the United Nations agree that cannabis was a non-medicinal plant. And then in 1961, with the Single Convention Treaty, any country that wanted to be part of the UN, any signatory country, they had to deny the use of cannabis to their people. So believe me, it was a fix. And this gentleman right here, John Kennedy. In 1962, credible sources report that President Kennedy routinely uses marijuana to relieve his back pain and plans to have the drug legalized. Maybe that was another reason they killed him. Now we get into the flower children and hippies. I was never one of them. I always had short hair. I was just, I never had long hair, and I didn't take part in any of this. But when they all started, when the young people started using hemp quite widely in North America at that time, I think it really started to get the young people thinking about what was wrong with this world. And one big thing that was wrong, of course, was that right there, the Vietnam War. It took many years, I think it was 1974, before it was finally brought to an end, but the peace protests and everything in the States, I think, had a lot to do with it. 1966 to 1976, millions of Americans illegally used marijuana daily, and new federal research conducted by independent university scholars indicates a wide array of beneficial effects, or beneficial uses. Numerous and sometimes weekly reports in medical journals tell of the positive therapeutic benefits of using cannabis for treating epilepsy, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, multiple dystrophy, and tumors, asthma, glaucoma, and nausea. Notice they say tumors. Even before the Virginia study, they knew. These studies conclude that crude natural cannabis is the best and safest medicine of choice for many serious health problems. 1975, researchers at the Medical School of Virginia discovered that cannabis is incredibly successful for reducing the size of many types of tumors, both benign and cancerous. The study goes on to identify numerous positive effects, which include lively, merry, more responsible attitudes, a general sense of well-being, and healthy self-esteem, and a greater work motivation. They always like to tell us that, you know, if your kids smoke cannabis, or they'll go into your basement and they'll live there forever. They'll never go find a job because they're just potheads. Well, I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, I've known people that have smoked marijuana for 40 years. They're some of the most productive people in our society. So, another bald-faced line. There's George. Another hero. Big man in the drug industry. 1977, George Bush leaves his post as director of the CIA and is appointed as the director of Eli Lilly by Dan Quayle's father and family, who along with Bush are major shareholders in Eli Lilly. 1982, Omni Magazine and other sources report that Eli Lilly, Abbott Labs, Pfizer, Smith & Kline, and French, and other drug companies would lose hundreds of millions to billions of dollars annually if marijuana were legal in the U.S. I love this one. Keep marijuana away from your children. It will harm them. They'll become schizophrenics. This lady did a study in the 1980s, and what she found, well, she's a doctor, Melanie Drescher, that the healthiest babies born on this planet are born to hemp-using mothers who live in Jamaica. That's what the study proved. The babies were the most developmentally ahead of other children whose mothers didn't use hemp. And the study was followed up. It's all the truth. And I mean, you can't deny what's obvious. If smoking marijuana or eating hemp cookies or whatever, if that doesn't harm a baby that's in the developmental stages in the womb, well, what harm would it be to give it to your child? You know, today they have these diseases, well, made-up diseases, attention deficit disorder. Then they put your child on amphetamines, like Ritalin. That's okay. You know, have a nice pill. Well, what would be wrong with a 10-year-old taking a little bit of oil? I'm not talking about getting the kiddies high, but a little bit of oil, it would, you know, and there's no need for them to, these chemicals are dangerous. They don't know what long-term effect that's going to have. So, I think this woman did a very important piece of work, and although, again, her study has more or less always been hidden, but if you look it up, you'll find it, and it's exactly the way I said it is. So women smoke a little marijuana. Big deal. Let women enjoy their pregnancies. I think these hyperbolic warnings about marijuana and pregnancy have made women absolutely nuts. I agree. 1987, 15th edition of American Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy, the U.S. military's official field manual, says about cannabis in part, chronic or periodic use of cannabis produces no physical dependence or social dysfunction. There is little evidence of biologic damage even among relatively heavy users. The chief opposition to the drug rests on a moral and political foundation. In 1988, the DEA's administrative law judge, Francis Young, takes medical testimony for 15 days and reviews hundreds of documents to conclude that marijuana is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. Now, this is the Drug Enforcement Administration's own judge. Did they take his advice? They're still out there kicking people's doors in. Now, this is Dr. David Suzuki, This is the man that I told you about that put out the nature of things in Canada. And he was the first one I contacted. You see, at that time, I didn't understand what was taking place, but in 1997, the Canadian government made hemp a Schedule II drug. So it could, again, be used in medicine. So when they did that, what they were doing was they're opening the door for the pharmaceutical companies to legally use it. They didn't want us to have it, but they, like, just slowly adjust the public to this way of thinking. And that's what they were doing. And when I come along with this information, I guess I kind of threw a monkey wrench right into the spokes, because we showed everybody how to produce it themselves. But they were getting ready to bring this out. Actually, they're still working on it. There's a researcher in Spain, I believe, that's supposed to be working with cannabis, and what he wants to do, he wants to take the high-grade oils, or the cannabinoids, and mix them with the chemo. We'll take something that can cure you and mix it with the poison. That way we can squeeze more money out of your pockets. That's what it's about. So this is the situation we're in at the present time. And it's not a good situation. We cannot let this fall back into the hands of the drug companies. These people have held this medicine's use back. And, well, like I said, in the 70s, around 1975, 76, Gerald Ford, who was then President of the United States, he gave full right to the research back to the drug companies. And of course, their dream was to actually produce these synthetic THC and other cannabinoids and take the high out of it. Well, where's the danger in getting high? I mean, look what the drug industry gives us. Look at the opiates, OxyContin. 80% of the deaths that occur today from street use, they're dying from pharmaceuticals. Over 80% of people. But they're not concerned about the high you get from that stuff. But the high you get from marijuana, it's harmless. If you take too much marijuana, even with oil, if you take too much, the effect wears off in an hour, 2 hours. You're back to normal. You're not harmed. If you take, even simple drugs like aspirin. I mean, thousands of people are dying every year from aspirin. Nobody's dying from hemp. So, the whole thing's a fraud. Now we're getting, one second, another drink. Lucky I'm not an opera singer. Because then the tomatoes would be flying. Where are we at here? All right, let's get into what the oil can treat. You ready for the checker? I'm coming back with this one. Oh, wait a minute. We don't get the. Oh, well, yeah. This is quite long here. Do you want to? Okay. I think we're going to take about a 5-minute or 10-minute break, and then we'll be right back. If it's okay, folks.
Okay. Great.